Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our CPD session. We've got several that I know are going to be joining us today, and an awful lot more that are going to be watching this on playback. So, without further ado, we will get into the content for today. So, we'll start with our usual afternoon housekeeping. So, the session today is intended to be a practical. It's not going to be about a legal lecture, and it's not legal advice. The purpose today is to give managers, business owners, supervisors, health and safety professionals a bit of an understanding about how health and safety offences are assessed, what penalties can be levied, why they vary so significantly, and what businesses can do before there's a problem to improve your control and your defensibility. We're going to keep the session to the maximum of 1 hour. The main content will take us through prosecution risk, through the sentencing structure and the factors that can increase or reduce the seriousness. And then we will look at practical evidence that businesses should be trying to build day to day. Before we get into the detail of that, so a few points on our housekeeping. So if you're able, come and follow us on the Scott Risk Management LinkedIn page. We use the LinkedIn to share our CPD session updates, our practical health and safety commentary, legal and regulatory updates, and examples of how businesses can make health and safety more workable. The session today is going to be recorded. It will be made available through our YouTube channel after the event. So if you want to revisit any part of the session, or you want to share it internally with any of your colleagues, you'll be able to do that through that channel. If you do have any questions on the session today, please drop the Q&A session into the Q&A box. We will go through those and we'll be monitoring as we go through, and then pick those up at the end of the session. We do offer CPD certificates for all of our sessions. They are available by request after the session. So if you email Paul, and I'll put his details in here so that you've got those, and he will arrange to send that across to you. Yeah. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the CPD series is designed to be practical and useful. The intention is to go back to basics where needed, and we focus on the legal requirements and then real world delivery. And we avoid making health and safety more complicated than it needs to be. Okay, we like to keep it simple. So we're building this as a monthly CPD series. It is there as a focus for managers, supervisors, health and safety professionals, business leaders and owners. As the series develops, we'll be working on additional topics and continue to work on getting topic suggestions in, so that we'll invite guest speakers where we have specialist subjects that would benefit from a different voice than people just listening to me on health and safety. So today's topic is on prosecution, risk and sentencing. The aim is to make the session not based on fear, but it's to help organisations understand what the courts look at when the health and safety executive have brought a case to court, and how everyday management systems can either strengthen or weaken the position of the business. So a quick introduction today. Before we get into the content. So my name is Liam Scott. I am the founder and the managing director of Scott Risk Management. My background covers kind of lots of different sectors, including nuclear, defence work, engineering. I've done some work in heavy manufacturing, fast manufacturing, consumer goods, construction, housing, law firms, energy, warehousing, and a lot in food manufacturing as well. Across those sectors, there's one consistent theme: that prosecution risk rarely comes up from a single piece of missing paperwork. It normally comes from a gap between the system that exists on paper and what's actually happening in our workplaces. Okay, so Scott Risk Management provides specialist health and safety consultancy. We provide training and we provide support through our SRM Genie software platform. And our focus is practical risk management, so helping businesses to set up systems that they can actually use, that managers can monitor, and that directors can rely on within businesses. Paul will be supporting the session later on, and he is going to be supporting the CPD delivery, but also be managing Q&A and any follow-up requests. So if you want to get a CPD certificate, more than welcome to get in touch with him, and he can send that over to you for you to put that into your CPD portfolio. Today's focus is practical. It's going to be how offences are assessed, why fines are sometimes so significant and so varied, and then how we build defensible evidence within our business before problems occur. So the session format today, what we're going to be trying to learn through this session, we'll spend the first few minutes just setting this out. Then we've got kind of 45 minutes on the core CPD content. Towards the end, we'll take a look at how we use our Genie software to support businesses to put in place prevention and defensibility within our live practical space. And then the final part of this will be Q&A for anybody who's got any kind of questions or anything, and then we will close the call. By the end of this session, you should understand how health and safety offences are assessed by the courts, recognise the factors that can influence the fines, and be able to identify practical steps that reduce prosecution exposure and improve defensibility of your business. So this is obviously CPD guidance. This isn't specific legal advice. If at any point you are dealing with a live incident, an investigation or a prosecution, then take the appropriate advice from either your health and safety consultant or legal team. It's a very important distinction. So we will look at why prosecution matters. So the reason prosecution matters isn't simply because we've got a potential fine. The broader issue is what a prosecution reveals about the business. When something goes wrong in business, the regulator and the court will take a look at the evidence that's presented in front of them. They will ask what risks existed, what the business knew or it ought to have known, what control measures were in place, and whether those control measures were actually implemented. So the risk is not only the accident itself, it's about what the evidence says and the quality of the system that you are operating behind it. So the core message today is that health and safety offences are concerned with your failure to manage risk, not necessarily the accident. So that means that serious injury or fatality isn't the only route to enforcement or prosecution. So the health and safety executive and then the courts are interested in the risk created by a breach of legislation. What was the seriousness of the harm that could have occurred? How likely was that harm to have occurred? And then how many people were exposed? Was this a one-off issue, or is there evidence of wider weakness in your business? And this is why the evidence matters so much. So your records, evidence of where you've identified issues and you've put in place corrective actions, how you manage risk through your risk assessment, how you are assessing and managing competency and how you manage your competency records, inspections, your audits, your management reviews to tie it all together, and then your response to incidents become the story of how the business manages risk overall. So the business doesn't want to be in a position where the only evidence available is what you create after an event. So when you've been summoned to court, that isn't the start point of your evidence. You want your evidence to be there. The strongest position is being able to show that risks were identified and controlled. You did have monitoring in place. You've escalated issues before anything's gone wrong, and you might be in court because there's been a single lapse or a single issue which has resulted in an incident, but you can demonstrate that through the story that you tell about how you manage risk in your business. So how can enforcement start? So it starts in a number of ways. The obvious route is an accident or a dangerous occurrence, which requires us to make our report to the HSE. It can come from a near miss. It could come from a health and safety concern, a complaint from a worker that's been submitted directly to the HSE, a contractor issue in which the contracting organisation or individual might report that to the HSE, or it might be an inspection finding from a proactive health and safety inspection, either by the health and safety executive or your local authority, depending on how your business is governed. Sometimes the original trigger might not be dramatic, but it opens up the wider question about how you manage safety and whether the business has effective control. So an inspector might identify, for instance, poor guarding, unsafe access, unmanaged contractors, poor lifting arrangements, poor control of substances, or a lack of evidence around how you implement training and supervision. The issue then becomes not only what was seen on the day, but whether the business can demonstrate that the risk was being managed. So that's where the paper trail matters. So that's where we have to have proportionate management systems in place. So things like missing, late, or inconsistent records can make a reasonable system look weak. Repeat failure patterns can matter as well. So if the same issue appears across multiple inspections or audits, where we're going out and doing our safety audit every month, we're picking up the same issue, it's not being adequately controlled, we're not putting preventative measures in place. Same with audits, whether that's an internal audit or whether that's client audits, and they're finding the same pattern and the same issues. Where we've got a history of near misses, where we're repeatedly reporting the same near miss or the same incident, that can in some cases mean a stronger evidence of an issue, because you have a systemic failure rather than in an isolated oversight, so an isolated incident that's resulted in an accident or in a concern being raised. So we have our incident, the complaint or an inspection that's triggered the HSE's attention. They've come to carry out their investigation. So that can be looking at things like physical evidence, they could be looking at your documentation, they could be carrying out interviews, reviewing your procedures and your training records, looking at how you're maintaining equipment, how you're implementing suitable supervision, and management decisions that are being made. They can look at all of that evidence from your management system, and crucially, if you have that evidence in your management system. The enforcing authority will then decide what action is appropriate. So that could be that they give advice, they might issue a breach under fee for intervention, which keeps it outside of the court, but very much still requires you to make changes in your business. They could issue an improvement notice or a prohibition notice. They might take that in a more serious way, and that could be a caution or direct prosecution. And then if the matter reaches court, that is where we talk about the court considering things like culpability, harm. They assess the turnover of your business. Then they consider things like your aggravating and mitigating factors in your business as well. So the key point to this is the best time to influence the evidence is before anything goes wrong in your business. So the best time to do it is when everything is going okay and we need to make improvements, rather than having an incident and then trying to do everything that we should have done beforehand whilst we're under the scrutiny of the HSE and under the court system. So the legal foundation of all of this, it's in the Health and Safety at Work Act when we talk about health and safety in the workplace. In particular, Section 2 is the duty to your employees. Employers must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the health and safety and welfare of their employees at work. Section 3 then extends to duties to non-employees. So that includes people who might be affected by the businesses at the undertaking, such as contractors, visitors, members of the public, and others who might not be directly employed, who might be around your work activities, be that other tenants in the buildings or other people in that area where they might become directly affected by the work that you're doing. And for senior personnel, Section 37 becomes relevant here. So Section 37 is particularly relevant if you're a director or a manager of the business. So where an offence by a company has been committed with the consent, so you've allowed it to happen, connivance, you've allowed it to happen, neglect, there's something that you haven't done to deal with an issue, of a manager, a director, secretary, or a similar officer of the business, that person can also be found liable. So in practical terms, when we take this back to your individual businesses, the question is rarely about did you have a document that showed that. The real question will be, whether you've managed the risks as far as reasonably practicable, were suitable control measures identified, were they implemented correctly? So, we've identified a control measure, but have we actually put it in place, and is it working as intended? Have we monitored it to make sure that it is still operating at the right level, it is still happening as frequently as it should be? Did managers act on warning signs? So was there evidence before our incident has happened, before the HSE have come out onto site, that something was wrong? And did directors have visibility of unresolved risk as well? So all of those will come into whether or not any of those relevant pieces of legislation would be utilised in the legal foundation of being taken to court. How the decisions are framed in enforcement. So before we reach sentencing, it's useful to understand how enforcement decisions are framed. So the HSE enforcement policy states general principles and an approach that the HSE and local authorities are expected to follow when taking enforcement decisions. So the enforcement management model then gives inspectors a framework to help them decide whether enforcement action is needed and what type of action is then deemed appropriate. So that can include decisions on whether or not they're going to issue an improvement notice, a prohibition notice, or a prosecution. So that is all different types of forms of enforcement action to your business, and they will use that enforcement management model to determine the most reasonable course of action. For businesses, the important point is that the decisions are influenced by the seriousness of the risk, the standard that is expected of the business, the actual standard that was observed, so the reality from what you should be doing to what you are doing, and then duty holder factors such as whether or not there is a history of poor health and safety if you've had previous prosecutions. Your attitude towards health and safety is a big part of that, and then your cooperation with the investigation and your response to their investigation is also very important. So if a business responds really badly, they've had repeat issues, and they can't produce reliable, consistent evidence, it becomes harder to defend the position of the business, in which case enforcement and then into prosecution is going to be more likely for that business. So then we move into understanding the sentencing guidelines. So we've been through enforcement. Enforcement have been instead they're going to issue an improvement notice or a prohibition notice, or they're going to take you to court because they believe that you are in breach of the legislation. You go through court, you will present your case, they will present their case, and then we look at sentencing. So when we move and we look at the sentencing guidelines themselves, this is where the court moves from the fact of the offence. So the offence has already been looked at and you've either been deemed guilty or not. This now looks at the offence as an assessment of seriousness and financial penalty. And the structure matters because it explains why fines can be so different between different organisations, even if everything else about the incident itself is the same. So it might look similar on the surface, but you can end up with a much different financial penalty as your outcome. So the definitive guideline for health and safety offences, it came into force in early 2016, and it remains the core sentencing framework for health and safety offences. So it applies to health and safety offences by organisations and individuals. It sits alongside other related guidance, so for things like corporate manslaughter, or if you work in the food industry, food safety and hygiene offences as well. The purpose of this is to create a structured approach rather than simply saying, as a judge or a magistrate, kind of what feels like the right level. The court has to work through a process of identifying the seriousness, looking at the culpability for the business, the level of harm that has either been achieved or is present, the turnover of the business, and then there is underneath that section an approach for how you can make adjustments either for aggregating factors or mitigating factors. So the kind of the positive and negatives that can make your fine lesser or greater. For business owners and managers, the practical value of understanding the guidelines, it shows where the exposure comes from. It's not just about the accident itself. It's about setting the standards in the business, having the systems in place that generate the evidence that you need, and having that run in your business in an effective way. It also is useful to know about your business size and whether the business has acted responsibly and proportionally to the size of the business, both before and after the event. When you look at the sentencing guidelines, there are three big levers to remember. The first is about culpability. This is about how far the organisation fell below the expected standard. Do you have things like recognised controls in place? Have you ignored concerns that were raised? Were previous incidents or audit findings correctly and appropriately acted on? And was this failing that is now in front of the court an isolated incident, or is it systemic? So are they looking at something that kind of has happened based on only one plausible way it could have happened through the business, or is this actually something that realistically could happen again, and could happen again in other ways where you would have another incident or another event, in which case could become liable for a second prosecution. The second lever there is about harm. So this isn't just harm that has actually occurred. The court has to consider the seriousness of the harm risked and the likelihood of that harm arising. So how likely it is that the harm could actually be realised in the business. So it also considers in that harm category how many people were exposed, and then it also considers whether actual harm did occur. The third section in there is about turnover. So the guideline uses turnover to reach a start point and a range for your fine, because a fine that's significant one business might not be for another. So this is where we can have two similar incidents that result in very different penalties, because the penalty is meant to be a pain to the business. If you have a small business that might only have a turnover of £100,000 versus a company that has a turnover of 50 million, the pain isn't going to be felt in the same way. So turnover is now included in that sentencing guideline. So when we go through these, we'll go through them individually. So step one that they look at is culpability. Keep all the slides nice and still. So the first step is about culpability. So this is about the degree of which you were at fault. And at the top end of culpability, so very high end culpability, can be about a deliberate breach or a flagrant disregard for the law. So this isn't simply something about somebody's got something wrong. It's that you've chosen to ignore the law or clearly disregarding what should have been done. Now, for people who are using on CPD sessions like this, that's not normally the case. So I'm going to assume that we would not be in that kind of high end area. The next one down is the high culpability. So this can include situations for a business where the organisation has fallen far short of the expected standard. So this could be where we've got industry recognised measures that should be in place. We have ignored employee concerns. We failed to make changes after prior incidents. So if anybody was on the previous session where we looked at the importance of reporting and investigating incidents, if you don't take the incident as an opportunity to learn, that can also demonstrate a high culpability to the business. You might have also had things like previous breaches where the HC might have come in and previously given an improvement notice, and then you've resolved it, and then that's been closed, and then they've come back and they've seen that actually we have a serious or a systemic failure to address risk in the business. That can also be a reason to keep you into the high category. Medium culpability, so this is demonstrating that you have systems, but they weren't sufficiently adhered to or implemented based on the event that is in front of the courts. And then lastly, the low culpability, so this is where the organisation or the business has got they've fallen below the standard, but they haven't. It's a very small gap, so they've not fallen far from the expected standards. That might be that you've made significant efforts to manage and address risk, and even though they were inadequate on this specific occasion, the failing was minor and it was isolated. So for businesses, This is where records can make a major difference in your case building and your storytelling to the courts. So evidence of you having active monitoring in place, action closeout either through inspections and audits or from your investigation findings, being able to demonstrate how you are implementing competence within your business. So that is training people either through external third-party accredited courses, delivering your own internal training and verification processes so you can demonstrate that people are competent, and then demonstrating that you have a process in place for escalation and review to show that the organization was managing risk rather than ignoring it. So all of those things there can help demonstrate what level of culpability the business would be liable for in the case of a fine. The next one here to look at is about harm. So there are, in the seriousness, there is 3 levels, A, B, and C. A being the most serious, so that is reserved for death or very serious life-changing harms. Level B includes substantial long-term impairments, or, I'm going to read this bit here specifically, progressive, permanent, or irreversible conditions all fit into level B. And then level C is all of the other incidents, so where they don't qualify into A and B. So the court will take a look at the seriousness and categorize it A, B, or C. They will then consider whether the likelihood of the harm, so how likely it was that this would have happened, would be high, medium, or low. Those 2 factors combined produce the initial harm category for the sentencing guidelines. The court will then consider whether multiple people have been exposed, whether any actual harm was caused. As we've said, this doesn't have to come from an accident only. Those factors can then move the assessment up or down, and move the case higher within the ranges of their fines. The important message in this, so that key message on the screen there, health and safety sentencing is not only about injury that actually happens. So if a business creates the risk of death or serious injury, the seriousness might still be considered high, even if on that occasion where that incident has happened, nobody was injured. So if they think actually the incident could have resulted in death or life-changing harm, whether or not you did might still result in a level A seriousness rating as part of the sentencing guidelines. And then what we have here is risk created versus risk outcome. So this is where we separate the outcome from the risk. So things like an unguarded machine might not injure somebody today, but it might still expose your operatives to the serious and foreseeable risk that being exposed to an unguarded machine would bring. A fall from height might not occur because somebody got lucky, but the risk may still have been significant. So repeated weak control show that the issue wasn't a one-off mistake. It's part of a wider management failure, which then features into that risk element. So the key question there for the business is, what records could we use to prove that it's a one-off issue, not a management failure of the business? Would your records show that the risk was known and actively managed, or would they show that the risk had been allowed to continue? So this is things like where we're raising issues in inspections and audits and incidents and near-miss investigations. If we are not adequately dealing with it, then it is difficult for us to demonstrate that the management is in place. Therefore, it is likely that when we look at the risk category, we're going to feature quite highly. Then we look at turnover and proportionality. So this is why the same offence can have a very different financial consequence for 2 different organisations. As safety people, we don't tend to get involved in growing the business and creating turnover for our businesses. So we don't really get much of a say in this. This is literally based on our profit and loss statement showing our turnover. But the guideline categorises us as either micro, small, medium, large, and very large businesses. So very large businesses, 50 million over, there is still a category above that as well. So micro businesses, the turnover is no more than £2 million. For small businesses, between 2 and 10. Medium is between 10 and 50, and large is £50 million or more turnover. So crucially, it's not about profit, it is about turnover. We then have a category for very large organisations, which the court has the ability to treat an organisation as outside of the standard four ranges and into that very large fifth category if it is needed to achieve a proportionate sentence. So if the 50 mil turnover business is still not going to be detrimentally affected by the fine that the court could levy, they can move beyond that into that very large category. So the court expects to see that financial information. The fine that they leverage has to be proportionate, but it has to be large enough to bring home to management and to shareholders the need to comply with health and safety law. That's why it has to be on a scale for businesses so that the business feels the pain. It's not about punishing the business, it's about creating a meaningful penalty relevant to the scale of the business. So when we look at this, we look at the same facts and different outcomes. This is the slide that I want people to take away. This is the kind of single summary of kind of everything we're talking about in this session. So we imagine the same scenario. So we go back to our unguarded machine. It might expose a worker to foreseeable risk or to the risk of serious injury. We'll keep the broad facts the same. So we'll use the same harm category as category 2. This is where we're not talking about fatality, we're talking about kind of serious injury. With a high culpability, so the business have had flagrant disregard to the law, they've ignored their need in health and safety legislation. And as we can see on that slide there, for a micro organisation, the start point is just over 50 grand, with a range of between 30 to 110,000 pounds. So for a small organisation moving up that scale, the fine starts at £100,000 and the range is £50,000 to £450,000. Medium organisation, so your start point in a medium organisation where your turnover is between 10 and 50 million. The range there is between 200 and 220,000 to 1.2 million is the kind of the upper scale there for your range, and that start point of 450,000. And then as we get into our large businesses, the turnovers of 50 million plus, again keeping that high culpability and that high harm exactly the same as all the others, the start point for your fine would be 1.1 million. The range is at a lower end of 550,000 up to 2.9 million. So as we can see here, when we look at the kind of ranges of 54,000 to 1.1 million, you can see why the turnover is a significant element of how that fine is going to be levied to the business. So the same risk profile can have a very different financial outcome to the business. The court is looking very significant at the size and the means of the organisation in that regard. Culpability then changes that again. So for the same small organisation, the start point moves right down into that kind of lower category of 30,000 and it goes up to 100,000, and the same large step happens when you look at that 550,000 to 2.9 million range for larger businesses. So for us, for our takeaway in this is why your prevention matters and why having evidence of your prevention matters. If you can show as a business that you have effective systems, you're undertaking timely action where issues are identified, you have good leadership visibility and a learning attitude to health and safety where you're looking to make continuous improvement, you're going to be in a much stronger position than if our evidence shows that you've ignored concerns, you've got open actions that haven't been dealt with, you've got repeated failings in your business where we're seeing the same issues raised time and time again, or if there is cost cutting undertaken in the business, specifically at the expense of safety. So with those in mind, what things can push up our fine? So the court will identify that start point and the range that they're going to be penalising you within. Then it considers a bunch of factors that can increase the seriousness. So if you've had previous convictions or you've got a poor history of safety, that can push that fine up into the higher elements of those ranges. Cost cutting at the expense of safety is a significant factor, as I've said. So If you are cost cutting specifically due to safety, that is going to push your fine up because you're being penalised for a health and safety breach, and you are actively trying to cost cut specifically in the health and safety area. If during investigations you have tried to obstruct or conceal, if you've been caught trying to falsify documentation, and your poor health and safety record is there on show, that can all make your position as a business worse. So another practical factor is failing to act after the concern. So if you can't demonstrate that you've been brought to court for a failing, or you've had audits or inspections or previous incidents, if the business knew about the problem and it didn't act, it becomes much harder for the business to argue that the failing was isolated and unexpected, because there is evidence that it wasn't. So that's going to push the range of that fine up. So that's why it's important to have things like action management processes in place, so that you can demonstrate that an audit finding didn't just come up and we've left it and it's been sat open for months and it's got no owner, no due date, but we can demonstrate that we are being proportionate in how we are going to close actions. That might be something we can deal with that week. It might be something that is significant and is going to take us several months, but we can have a management process in place to show how we are being proportionate in our management. So on the flip side of putting that fine up, we also have levers to demonstrate how we can reduce the seriousness as well. So the guidelines, the sentencing guidelines, also recognise factors that can reduce the seriousness or support your mitigation. So you will put in factors for mitigation once you have been found guilty in court. So if you have no previous or recent relevant convictions, that puts you in a stronger position. If you put in voluntary steps to remedy the problem that's brought you to court, that is important, especially when the action has been prompt and it's been meaningful. And cooperation with the investigation can also assist in bringing that down. So if you've got effective procedures in place before the incident happened, you have prompt action management to prevent occurrence, you've taken evidence that you've got lessons learned processes in place, and they are embedded in your business, can also be important mitigations. The key element to all of this, the key phrasing in all this, is about evidence. So mitigation works best when it isn't something that you've created after the event. So we've had an accident and we've done this about it. If we can demonstrate that we had good management in place before, it was an isolated incident, and potentially we've made some improvements after that, but we had a lot of evidence available to demonstrate how we were managing our health and safety beforehand, that can put us in a really good position. So if the business can already show that we had active inspections and training, things like our risk assessments were already in place and they were to a good standard, we were already carrying out maintenance, where we had things like actions, we were demonstrating that we were closing out actions, we had processes in place to carry out things like health and safety management reviews, and we also had processes in place to escalate any safety concerns. That gives us a much stronger story to tell to the court. We spent a lot of time talking about the kind of the money element of this, but there's an important point to all of this as well, which isn't just about the fine. So the court has to consider compensation. It also has to consider any what's called ancillary orders. So you have things like a remedial order, which can require corrective action. So you might still, after all of this, get given a corrective action direct from the court to make a change to your process, to bring you up to the standard that is expected of a business with your means and with the risks that you are displaying. If the business hasn't remedied the failings by the time of sentencing, again, that can weaken your mitigation. Where you've had personal injury, loss or damage has resulted, the court must consider compensation and explain if it doesn't order it. So in some cases, compensation may be dealt with through civil courts, but it remains part of the overall consequence picture. So if an individual has also taken the company to court through the civil scheme and there is a fine that's been levied, the court will look at that ruling as well as it builds its picture. There can also be forfeiture in particular cases, so such as in cases where you might have explosive articles or substances in your business. From a practical perspective, the non-financial consequences are often very significant. So that can be things like, when we kind of group all that together, things like Corrective work, lots of management time spent to rectify things. You might need legal support to demonstrate what you're doing meets the legal requirements. The regulator may just come back and put additional scrutiny on to make sure that you have dealt with this. Then there are the added issues of things like insurance issues. Once you've had serious incidents like this, your insurance costs go up, your liability goes up. They will put in place specific requirements for you to manage or mitigate risks in a way that is sufficient and satisfactory to them in order to give you insurance. And then all the other messages as well, so things like reputational damage, where we know all of this will generate a lot of press, a lot of media attention to the business, which may result in clients not wanting to work with us. It might result in them going to kind of other businesses. So our revenue dries up, so our income dries up, which can obviously have a big, wide impact on the business as well. So things like our client confidence can be seriously impacted if we are in a court situation like this. And then you also have to consider as well, aside from all of those external elements, the internal disruption that causes to the business, whether that is to employees who are seeing that the company is being dragged through the press, lots of process change in the business. People don't like change anyway. When you start making significant change all in one go, it can have a significant impact as well. So all of these things are things to consider when we think about what comes kind of after the fine, after the court cases has taken place. For individuals and directors, we spoke a lot about organisations, and as we mentioned at the start very briefly, individuals can also be prosecuted. So employees, managers and directors can face enforcement action specifically themselves where their own conduct or neglect is relevant to the court case that's been brought. And that is all through Section 37. It can create personal liability where the offence by the company has been committed, as we said earlier, with the consent, connivance or neglect of a director, manager or similar officer. So for directors and senior managers, the question is, how did leadership set the business expectations, monitor the performance and act on its own risk? I didn't know is not always a safe position if the system was designed in a way that meant that leadership never saw unresolved risks. So things like board reports, if you only want the positives put in your board report, that would demonstrate that you should have known, but you didn't know because you've asked not to see it through your system. It's been designed in a way that leadership don't see the issues. And for senior people to not know what's going on, doesn't need to be every small detail, but they need to have visibility of significant risks in the business. So potentially things like overdue actions in the business, you can raise to your senior leadership teams. That might be overdue actions or actions that have had very little response or insufficient response from within the business. They also need to know about serious incidents, any trends that are appearing in the business, and any repeat failures. So when we apply the framework to a practical scenario, and we've got a couple here. So if a supervisor identifies that a machine guard is missing and production continues for 3 weeks because we've ordered a guard, but it's not going to be there for 3 weeks. No injuries taken place. Several operators use that machine. The first question that would be asked if the HSE were to come in and carry out an inspection on that day was, have we created risk? What harm could have occurred because of that risk and how likely was it? If the missing guard exposes operators to moving parts, then we may be looking at a serious harm risked to that person or to those individuals, even if no risk occurred. So if this became a prosecution matter, they would be looking at a high harm category. The second question is how many people are exposed. So if we've got several operators using the machine, that can shift the seriousness either up or down. If we're saying there's 20 people in the business and all 20 people have access to that piece of machinery with the guard off, we're potentially exposing 20 people. So we would expect our seriousness rating to go up as well. And then the third question, this would be about culpability. So was this a short-term isolated issue? Have we got effective temporary controls in place? We're not saying you can't use that piece of equipment until the guard arrives. You might be able to put some temporary control measures in place which are adequate in that interim period. Or have we got a management failure where production has continued and we haven't put any control in place whatsoever? And then the fourth question then will be about evidence. Have we recorded the issue? So have we recorded that we've got a machine running without a guard? Have we isolated or restricted access to the machine? Is there a temporary risk assessment that covers the change from the normal operation of that machine? Have we dealt with any escalation? So do we escalate this in a way where we might be able to get our guard delivered in 2 weeks rather than 3 weeks? What have we done with our operators? So have we instructed them to tell them actually we've got an issue with a guard, we're going to keep operating the machine because we've got these control measures in place, which will still protect you in the same way that the guard would. Either we've put an additional guarding process in place, or we've segregated your working area from the exposed part of the machine. How we've been able to demonstrate that we've got the repair being tracked and we're managers aware as well. So the simple point is that just because we haven't had an injury in that scenario doesn't mean there isn't a risk of prosecution. If the HC came in to see that and we hadn't demonstrated effective control, we would almost certainly be looking at some sort of enforcement action. Okay, and then for our second scenario, we have here about contractor work. So if a contractor starts work on site before they've carried out a health and safety induction, and before their RAMs have been reviewed and accepted by the company, so we've had visibility of them and we're happy with how they're going to operate. The task they're doing involves work at height. The contractor is stopped before anyone's hurt. So we've seen that they've started work and we've stopped them. The questions are different, but the framework is still applied in the same way. So it's still about who controlled the work. Was the site access processes clear? Did we have any permit or contractor approval requirements in our business, in our management system? Were security or host arrangements effective? Have we got warning signs there that have been ignored? And was there evidence that contractors understood our process? The defence isn't simply, oh, we've got a procedure. The question would be whether or not it's been effectively implemented. So if the evidence shows that the contractor controls were there, they were communicated, they were monitored, and the contractor was stopped quickly, that's one picture. If the evidence shows the contractor routinely accesses that work, they don't have an induction, they don't submit RAMs for review, they don't have their own RAMs on site, they don't have appropriate supervision either from the contractor organisation or from the host, that creates a very different picture when we look at our sentencing guideline. So what we have to look at is how we reduce exposure in practice. So we don't want to just have a huge set of requirements as to how we're going to manage risk in the business. We're going to look at how we manage the business so that we are in a position to reduce our exposure in the event of a legal outcome. So we look at how offences are assessed and how penalties can be influenced. The practical question is, what should we be doing before there is a problem? So this is all about how we reduce our exposure in practice. This isn't about creating paperwork. It's just about making sure that what we have in place reflects our real control in our business. So before an incident, good management evidence should always be visible across several areas. So risk assessments have to be specific. We can't just use generics. We have to have they have to be live and linked to the work that's going on. They shouldn't just be generic documents that sit in a folder. They never get used. They never get reviewed. They never get trained or briefed on. For things like Pure and for our asset control, we have to show that we have inspections done, whether that be third-party inspections or whether that's our own internal inspections to monitor that our equipment is safe to use. We have to be able to demonstrate maintenance. We have to demonstrate any defects are being logged and corrective actions have been recorded and closed. We also have to have competence records in place that show that people have had training, whether that's induction, whether that's specific line training or process training. And we have to be able to demonstrate that that is in place and relevant to the actual task that people are doing. Monitoring for our business should include things like inspections, audits, and management reviews that identify issues before incidents occur. So this is our proactive leading indicator work that we would be doing. Actions that come from that should be assigned. They should be prioritized appropriately based on the risk that we can foresee. And then we have to track them, and then any controls that are put in place, we have to verify that those controls are suitable, sufficient, and are in place. Leadership should also have visibility of any unresolved risk, so that it's not just about lagging data, it is about risk in the business that we haven't properly resolved. So if something happened tomorrow, could we demonstrate that the business was aware of the relevant risk that they needed to manage yesterday? Okay. What it looks like after an accident, how we demonstrate what good looks like. So after an accident, the response has to be how we demonstrate control, how we demonstrate our learning capability, and how we demonstrate the principles of prevention again. So our immediate priority after an incident is to secure our scene and manage the ongoing risk. Then the business needs to capture the facts early. So we covered this in our previous CPD session. So things like photographs, witness statements, witness details, all of our equipment condition, certification, things like our documentation for operating our equipment, evidence of our supervisor arrangements, our training records, and any immediate actions that we've taken there and then as soon as the incident has been brought under control. We then have to demonstrate that our investigations have, one, taken place, and two, are proportionate. So a minor first aid event doesn't need the same level of investigation as a serious injury, but the process still has to be structured. So we have to be able to tailor it depending on the level of severity. The aim for this is to identify the underlying causes and any system weaknesses. This is where we start getting into root cause analysis. So once we've done that, we'll then be able to assign our corrective actions with our owners and our due dates, review any relevant risk assessments to make sure we've captured the learning in those, adjustments to training if we need to make any adjustments to training, and our equipment and our supervision. So we have to be able to demonstrate all of those to demonstrate that post-incident we have carried out a review and we've made sure that these are all robust, and anything we've learned from the incident are then added into new revisions of that documentation. So a good response doesn't just look like a panic and paperwork. We're able to demonstrate that from our learning, we've made proportionate and reasonable changes and adjustments if they are needed. It isn't just, we've had an incident, we're going to rebrief everybody on how to do the job. If that's not sufficient, then we have to do more. When we look at the practical actions to reduce prosecution risks, if attendees were to take 3 or 4 actions from today, that's a good start. So first is understanding our high risk activities and maintaining a live risk profile for the business. So we don't just have a set of documents that say here's our risks. The second thing I would say is understand how you can close the loop. So if you've got corrective action trackers, great. If they aren't there, get something that's linked to managing the outcomes of inspections and audits and investigations, so that we can demonstrate that corrective actions are, 1, identified, and 2, tracked and verified to completion. So an open action in itself is not effective control. All that means is that we've demonstrated that we've got an issue that we haven't done anything about. The third is about evidence implementation. So procedures are only useful if they're used. You need evidence that shows that people have been trained, they're supervised, they're monitored, and they're held to the standard that we've set. And then the fourth in there is about escalating any unresolved risks. So if you've got risks that you're managing, whether that's through risk assessments that we haven't addressed the control measures properly, or we've got corrective actions that just have been ignored, or we've not given them proper time and attention within the relevant business function, we need to be escalating that to senior leaders. As we said earlier, senior leaders need to see visibility. We need to be able to demonstrate that we're passing this on as well. So if that risk remains open, it's an overdue or a repeated issue, leadership should know about it as well. And if it is important enough for the business to need to rely on it during a prosecution, so after prosecution, this is the kind of evidence that we would need to demonstrate, then it is important enough to put in place to manage before we have an incident where we need to be in the courts. You can pull various documents together in your defensibility evidence pack when you start looking at how you would defend against a prosecution for your business. It's the combined evidence from the business that shows how we've understood the risk and we've managed it. That is culmination of things like risk assessments and safe systems of work. It reflects all of our real operations. This is where we're pulling together training records, induction records, evidence that people were competent to do the job that they were doing, inspections and audits where we've monitored that the processes are in place and the standards are at the right level. We've got equipment that's maintained, so we're not using defective or dangerous equipment. Where we've got defects, we're resolving them correctly, and we've got pure evidence in there where we've got work equipment that's being operated. We would use things like our incident and our near-miss reporting process to demonstrate that we are undertaking things like trend analysis. We're taking learning to turn that into proactive learning opportunities to reduce things like near miss reporting. If we see a spike in a particular area, that means we would typically need to carry out a safety campaign or a safety focus in that area to raise the standard to reduce the concerns that were there. So being able to build all of those things. So that evidence does two things for the business. First, it helps prevent incidents because the business is managing the risk correctly. Second, if it goes wrong, it helps show what the business was doing to manage the risk, and then we can argue that it is so far as is reasonably practicable. And defensibility is then built through consistent evidence. It's not just one good document that we produce afterwards to show that we've got it all in place. Okay, so when we've got all of that considered, the things that we see that are common gaps. So we either have businesses where we've got lots of documentation, we've got management systems that are, they all weigh 2 ton, they all sit on the shelf, they all look great, but the evidence that they are implemented is very, very light. So the policies and the templates are there, but actually the controls and the evidence that has been implemented is not very strong at all. Action management is another common issue. So inspections identifying problems, but the actions sit open or it sits in emails being chased by the email that we send out every month saying, can we have an update on your action? Those issues there demonstrate that we're not managing it correctly, and spreadsheets that aren't properly verified. So lots of spreadsheets everywhere. We have training which is too generic and isn't linked to the specific risk that we are trying to manage. So people can have generic training but not competent evidence for their actual tasks, for the work that they're doing. And then repeated issues, identifying a warning there that we're not taking heed of the warning. So we might have the same observations appearing repeatedly, no escalation or root cause action dealt with, and that starts to then look like a management system weakness as well. And then that poor visibility matters. So directors may only see lagging indicators. So we might only be reporting to some kind of incidents and accidents after they happen. What we need to be doing is reporting all of the proactive stuff as well, so the risk visibility, where we're not dealing with corrective actions correctly. So unresolved risk should be given to senior managers early enough that they are able to influence the outcome. So we've mentioned we've got our Genie system. So in short, the aim of Genie is not to be a software that just protects against prosecution, because it doesn't do that. The aim of the system is to help manage risk consistently and be able to demonstrate what we've done. So our Genie system supports prevention by bringing risk assessments, pure asset checks, inspections and audits, all of your competency training, verification and training records, and your induction records all into one system. So it supports control by assigning actions, it tracks them, it helps escalate them, and it verifies closeout with clear ownership and due dates throughout all the whole system. So it supports your defensibility by keeping those incident records, investigation evidence, your witness statements, your audit trails, and helping put management reports together as well through the management reporting functionality. So that means your evidence trail is easy to find, it's easier to review, and it's easier to use when decisions need to be made. And from a prosecution prevention perspective, the value is the consistency of how that system is operated and adopted across a business. So from the defensibility perspective, the value is in the audit trail. Genie gives you the evidence behind everything to be able to deliver that safety story if you needed to during a prosecution. Beautiful. Right, and I think what we'll do is we will leave it there then. Thank you all for attending. As we've said, we have CPD certificates that we can issue to people if they want them after they have either attended live or seen this via YouTube. That recording will be available in the next couple of days. Our next session is going to be specifically on our Genie competence system, so we're going to show that in a couple of weeks' time. But other than that, thank you all for attending. Thank you all for watching this live on our recording through YouTube, and we look forward to seeing you either at the next session or having you sign up to pick this up later on as well. Thank you all very much.